Before we begin this evening's program, and before Professor Nuruddin introduces our author in this very special work, my duty today is just to say a few lines about the two gentlemen who flank the author. Of course, first, Ambassador Richard Verma, and is currently as well very involved, very engaged with the region. And to the other gentleman, who's a good friend and colleague, Professor Dr. Irfan Nuruddin, who heads the India Initiative at Georgetown University. Again, someone who is invested a lot in South Asia. And of course, this evening is about one of the pioneers of English writing in India, about Mulk Raj Anand, about whose works, whose novels we have all grown up reading. And sir, without further ado, stage is all yours. Yes.
Well, first, let me thank you, and Ambassador, let me thank you in particular for opening up the embassy to all of us and to my father and to our family and friends and all the assembled guests. It's really a special night for us. I will tell you that, you know, I think when people look at where the U.S.-India relationship is right now, they should look at the incredible role that you've played, and you've been a driving force, and really there were so many questions about what would 2017 look like, how would it go, and you've held, not only held it all together, you've really taken it to a new level, and we're really appreciative of everything you're doing in the relationship. Thank you. Let me introduce my friend, Professor Irfan Nuruddin from Georgetown University, who is my good colleague at Georgetown, where I serve as a Centennial Fellow. But when you think about the people that have really jump-started the study and thought on India, Irfan is at the top of the list. If you don't know his work, if you don't know his writings, he's really the guy to focus on in the years ahead. We have a lot of other friends and distinguished scholars here, and you're going to hear from them. We're going to try to keep this very interactive, and so not a lot of long speeches. We'd rather hear from someone I know there in the middle of the stage, Dr. Verma. And we're going to turn to him in just a few minutes, but we'll have it somewhat conversational style. You know, one of the privileges of serving as the U.S. ambassador was I got to go around India a lot. I went to every state, and I gave a lot of speeches. And my staff used to labor over all the speeches, and they would prepare carefully worded remarks. And most of the time, I would set those speeches aside, much to their dismay, and I got to do something that was really fun. And I got to talk about my dad and my mom. And of course, the speechwriters would say, "Oh, not again, here he goes." But around the country, no matter where I went, this story of my dad coming up from basically, you know, village life to breaking out from which really a very different existence into education and into formalized education, but then becoming a very elite scholar. Sometimes we forget it because we're so close to him, but when you read this book, you realize just what a kind of impact he's had, and his writings are really something, and they are really special, especially in today's climate, about what it means to be an immigrant. But I tell this story of my dad showing up in the United States in 1963 with $14 and a bus ticket and aspirations for a better life and a better future, and that's how it all started, and ending up in Iowa and Canada, and then Western Pennsylvania, of all places, where I grew up, and we spent the bulk of our time, and that's where he spent the bulk of his teaching. more time in Johnstown, Pennsylvania than in India. And so talk about cross-cultural and really having an impact. And this is not the first book launch event we did. The first book launch event we did was in Johnstown at the University of Pittsburgh there, at the campus there. And the number of students that came out and the number of faculty who said that they were shaped and moved and molded by his teachings and really just broadened the horizon of what was out there in terms of Indian literature and Indian philosophy. An incredible impact, and I'm glad we get a chance to hear from him tonight. And so, again, we're going to do this conversation style and hear from my dad, and then we'll open it up to all of you. Dr. Plotz is here, Dr. Vijay Chauhan is here, and we're going to read a couple of the letters that are in the book as well. But thank you all for being here very much. I really will just start from the beginning. Of all the scholars you could have chosen, of all the people you've come across, how did you first get connected with Mulkraj Anand? Why Mulkraj Anand? Give us some sense as to how this relationship started.
My relationship with Anand, if that's what you mean,
Yeah.
started many, many years ago. But interestingly, even in spite of the fact that we corresponded with each other very intimately as it could be, telling each other the true story of his life, why he started writing, and what his personal interests are. Over the years, then, this issue came out. It came out in 1991. I edited the South Asian Review for about 14 years. But at that time, I was a member of the advisory board. I was a special editor, guest edited this issue. Anand was very, very happy with this issue. And this was the beginning of our relationships. It has some very beautiful articles by Indian writers, by British writers, by American writers, the ones who knew Anand. But Anand is a very difficult figure, very versatile genius, Punjabi to the core. His mother was a Sikh. His father came from Amritsar. But he was in the army, could not make both ends meet in his own profession. So he joined the army. He was a Subedar in Peshawar, where Anand was born. But Anand grew up in Amritsar. He went to Khalsa College, Amritsar, graduated from the University of Punjab. But this is all where it started. He became revolutionary. The British government was badly after him. So he sort of fled away to England under the garb that he's going to do his PhD at the University of London. That's very true. He did PhD in London, and interestingly, he spent 20 years in England. He came back after 20 years, Well, that's one Anand, Mulak Raj Anand. Anand in England. And during that period, the most tempting part for anyone is how Anand came so close to all these British philosophers, British writers. So much so, he got married in London with an English girl, had a daughter who worked for the BBC. But it did not satisfy him on one thing, and only one thing, that all these British liberals during that period, they did not support the cause of Indian freedom. That is one thing that disappointed Anand the most. World War I, World War II, Bloomsbury Group, all the eminent members of the Bloomsbury Group. You know, one of the very interesting British gentlemen is George Orwell. George Orwell was born in India, was Inspector General of Police in Burma, but then he resigned. He was very disappointed with the colonial regime, the way the British treated the Indians and the Burmese. He came back to England. Was he a socialist? Was he a communist? Was he a leftist? All those terms. But Orwell said, no. I believe in socialism, but practical socialism for the common man. 2 books, 1984, Animal Farm, other books that he wrote. But he became a very good friend of Anand. He supported Anand. Very interesting. The first novel that Anand wrote, Untouchable, he had about 200 and some 40 pages written in London. He came to Gandhi's ashram, sought Gandhi's advice. Gandhi told him to cut it to about 100 pages or so. But you know, very interesting, Gandhi's advice to Anand, what to do with the untouchability, Gandhi's own philosophy was centered on this very point, the untouchables, untouchability in Hinduism. The book could not be published. And finally, E.M. Forster decided to write a preface to the book. Very interesting. Mulak Raj Anand and E.M. Forster, 2 good friends. E.M. Forster finally wrote a passage to India. Look, George Orwell and Anand worked together at BBC for many years. And Mulak Raj Anand's daughter worked also at BBC. Now, very interestingly, to make money as a student to survive in London during that period, It was very simple process. It was not bad. The English, the British colonial regime has decided the options in education. The Indians were sent to England, they would go to England, get educated, come back, but only to help the British government, ICS, IAS, all these different categories. But Anand rejected that choice. He wanted to be a writer. He chose to be a writer. Essayist, novelist, short story writer. Very interesting. Now, in that search for himself to be a writer, he came in touch with the Bloomsbury group, very distinguished, enlightened group of people. For example, Virginia Woolf and her husband Leonard Woolf. They together had founded a printing press called Hogarth Press. T.S. Eliot. Anand worked for T.S. Eliot. Anand was hired by T.S. Eliot to make summaries of important works. He had no time himself. The one poet who wrote The Wasteland. He was an American. He came in touch with several other British writers. Herbert Reed was his mentor. Herbert Reed. Bonami Dobry was Anand's intellectual mentor. Now, very interesting. Anand's second book is Coolie. Manu, a young man from the Kangra Hills, comes to the plains, Amritsar, Bombay, finally ends up in Simla. He dies there. This is one issue, of course, why I chose letters to be included in the book. In several of the letters, Anand explains his problem with T.S. Eliot. T.S. Eliot and another writer wrote a very warm book supporting Kipling, Rudyard Kipling. Kipling wrote Kim. Anand did not like Eliot's essay on Kipling. So the book Coolie was written as a protest against Kipling's philosophy, against Eliot's sport, patronage. This is how it all began.
Can I ask you a question? What was he so concerned about? What's the difference between the character in Coolie versus the character in Untouchable? Because you spend a lot of time in your book about that.
Untouchable has two major points. One, of course, is the Varnashram structure of Hinduism, casteism. However you take it. You can take it from the standpoint of revolutionaries. For example, those who do not like untouchability. from the untouchables. But the untouchable, first traced by Gandhi, his character Yuka. Although Anand was a Gandhian, he still, of course, is called a Gandhi. Very interesting. Anand and Gandhi. It's a great subject. It has not been explored. But Gandhi himself could not resolve the problem of untouchability. The British could not resolve the problem of untouchability. The Hindus themselves could not address the problem of untouchability. Now, one of the issues that the British thought it would solve, they offered them a choice, and that was conversion to Christianity. So hundreds and thousands of untouchables were converted to Christianity. And in the hope, of course, they thought they will lead a good life. And some of them, when they went to England, they found out that they were not welcome. It's a very interesting part of history. But Anand explored all these points. Science and technology, can it help untouchability? Christian missionaries, can they help untouchability? Gandhi, can he help untouchability? But the essay that E.M. Forster wrote, that is still one of the most beautiful essays. And now, you know what our Forster says? Only an Indian could have written the book Untouchability, not a European.
Can I ask you a question? So firstly, let me thank you, Dr. Verma, for the opportunity to be part of this conversation. It's very clear why for 40 years at the University of Pittsburgh-Johnson, you were a very popular professor. You still have it. Before you can have your samosas, there'll be a little exam that as well. This last point that you made was very striking. In some sense, as you said in your prefatory remarks, Anand spent so much of those formative years of his life, the early years of his life, in England. And yet, he is an Indian writer, right? And so let me just think about categories. We could imagine him as an Indian writer writing in English. Of course, an Indian living in England writing about a country that he left behind. How do you think about him? Should we understand him as an Indian writing in English, or really in the way that so many Indians after him have continued to write in English, or is this an Indian in exile, very much something that comes up in your book, who thinks of himself as having to go to England in order to express the ideas in his head that he would have had a hard time doing had he remained in India?
I think it's a very interesting point. The way he was treated when he was in England, he sometimes got the impression that people like him are not welcome there. Color and a colonized mind, Indian, coming from India. You know the story of Dickens, one character in Great Expectations, who goes to Australia. At that time, of course, Australia was a newly found colony. And, but part of the deal was that if you choose to go to Australia, that was for the criminals. Your crime will be forgiven but on one condition: you will not come back to England. And if you come back to England, you will be prosecuted for the original crime. But to cut the story short, Anand knew that. Different liberals during that period were supporting the common man in England. The common man in England suffered the same sort of fate as the common man in India, except it was more intensified in India because the British colonial structure, the way it was set up during that period.
Let me ask you a quick follow-up, if I may. In one of the letters, or maybe it's an interview, I forget, you mentioned that Gandhi ji at some point asked Anand why he didn't write in Punjabi as opposed to writing in English. And Anand's response is, Punjabi isn't even the official language of Punjab, right? Yeah, and of course, he's making a remark about colonialism in that. But I want to just paraphrase Foster's in some sense. If only an Indian could have written Untouchable, do you think that book could have been written in any language other than English?
I think there are, for example, the book Across the Black Waters. I think you should read that. One of my friends sitting there is a scholar who has recently published some reviews. If you read that book, Anand, it's Anand only amongst the writers who has put a lot of original Indian language, for example, a lot of Punjabi, that he has translated. And some of the words have not even been translated. So my friend Kavasji, another Anand scholar, he translated all those words for the readers. And, with the index also provided those translations. In Punjab, he was sort of, one question was raised that why didn't he write Punjabi? That's a question you are raising. But he wrote in English because I think he was in England during 20 years. 9 books, and very good books. 9 novels that he wrote. Let me show you. Private Life of an Indian Prince. This trilogy was written in England, not in India. I want to talk about this Across the Black Waters. I wasn't myself certain about Across the Black Waters. One of my friends who is from Jalandhar, has settled in England now, showed me the book. I was surprised. I said, are you trying to laugh at me? He said, no, this is a book that we have published here in England, Across the Black Waters. Those Sikh soldiers, their children, grandchildren, who have settled in England, looked at Across the Black Waters. 70,000 Sikh soldiers lost their lives in World War I. And this is the only book that's written by an Indian, World War I. So an edition was prepared by those Indians settled in England, which is very interesting. And now the second edition is coming, and they have illustrated some of the pages, and they have put Punjabi words, letters, you know. So some of these issues have come out, but when Anand was writing, at that time, of course, he had no support. He was very poor. He was living in London. He had no employment, regular employment. And the only thing he wanted was spare time so that he could write. And then, of course, he would associate with other people. For example, Orwell was very poor, very poor. And, but that poverty was a choice he made.
Can I ask a question? So all these famous people, T.S. Eliot, George Orwell, Anand, how does a professor at the University of Pittsburgh at Johnstown begin what is over 100 letters? Do you just pick up and type a letter and send it and hope for a reply? How does this happen?
The thing is that I was the editor of South Asian Review. South Asian Literary Association, I am probably the only living founding member of that association. And anyway, our purpose was, of course, to deal with South Asia. And that included, of course, Ceylon, Nepal, Burma, India, Pakistan, Afghanistan, this and that, you know, those areas, South Asia. We were more concerned with the development of those countries, literature, language, philosophy, this and that. We were part of the MLA, Modern Language Association of America, and we found out that the MLA was very good to the Scandinavian countries, but not good to Asia. We revolted, and finally we got our answers. And it was in Chicago that we were given the sort of option that we could have 2 sessions, 3 sessions, this and that and that. Also, the South Asian Review, the journal, was founded. When I took over as editor, my purpose at that time was that I tried to incorporate as much as I can what's going on at the present time. For example, how many of you know that Vivekanand came here to this country? Lala Hardyal came here to this country. Or the other Sikhs that came to the West Coast, what happened to them during that period? A number of issues involved. We were very good scholars, but we were writing about different kinds of things. Shelley, Keats, Wordsworth, Coleridge. What about India? So the issues are very interesting.
Let's hear a couple letters that are actually in the book, if that's okay. We have some volunteers. I use that word loosely. Yeah.
Happy volunteer.
Sonia Verma, if you want to take the first one.
I am Katie Verma's eldest grandchild. Thank you, Papa, for inviting me to read an excerpt from this book. So this is letter number 9. It's dated March 1st, 1991. Dear Dr. Verma, I was relieved to have your letter of the 19th of February, reporting the safe receipt of my dossier for your reference. I am afraid Professor Jagdish Shivpuri is untraceable. I hope he is not dead. He was a professor in Siddhartha College, Bombay. They don't know anything about him, his whereabouts, or his survival in this mad, sad, and bad world. The only thing to do then is for me or you to revise the 2 essays. Please tell me which ones interest you, and can I have any idea of what you are including, or is it still to be decided? Anyhow, I have been elected recently as a fellow of the Satya Academy, one of the rare 7 and surprisingly the only one from Indian English writing yet. They are considering doing honors and have decided to translate all the volumes of the 7 Ages of the Man. I am surprised because they gave me the Satya Academy Prize for Morning Face when it should have been for Untouchable years before they took notice. There is tremendous prejudice against Indian English writings, even though the writings in the Rashtra Bhasha are unequal to its importance as a language, and the regional languages naturally write about local issues, while Indian English writing is compelled to be mainstream literature. I have a photograph somewhere of myself with my mentor, Bonomi Dobre, taken some years ago, and the others with Ian Forster, Leonard Woolf, Elizabeth Bone, George Orwell, Stephen Spender, Day Lewis, Louis MacNeice, and others were bombed out by Hitler during the war. But I suggest do not introduce much personal element and patronage from the British writers, because though the UK intelligentsia was very liberal and appreciative, the really genuine people were the writers of the 30s, like Andre Marlowe, John Strachey, J.D. Burnell, J.B.S. Haldane, Jack Lindsay, Edgell Rickword, and many of the left. Do write to me about what you might include, even tentatively. I suggest reviews of The Bubble may be significant, and there is an article on The Bubble already published in a book by a young critic, Rajesh Palan, which is significant of the new venture in my 7 Ages, to break down the form of the English narrative novel. With warm regards, sincerely, Mulkraj Anand.
I'm Zoe Verma. I'm Dr. Verma's another granddaughter. And I'm sorry if I don't pronounce all the words right. Don't tell him, but English is not my best subject. So this letter is dated 27th August, 1993. Dear Dr. Verma, my first thought on receiving the South Asian Review special number on my writings was of relief, as it showed that you are well and did not write, perhaps because you were waiting to send me the gift of the special issue of this magazine. I am grateful for the conscientious collection or selection of the critiques of my novels. After 15 books on my books, some of which went over the ground chronologically, the essays in your anthology are selective and treat the early novels almost de novo, with a freshness of outlook and insights which bigger critical books sometimes lacked, especially your concentration on the essentials. Your own essay is very perceptive and reflects your readings of my novels as well as much else which you and I share in common through our readings of European literature. The appearance of this special issue in USA, which will, doubtless, go to English departments of universities, may perhaps bring the open-eyed and open-minded American youth to look at the human condition of our people more seriously than from newspapers' reports of the past poverty and decay. Some of them may seize on the saving graces of the characters in my novels, which give hope in spite of the overall despair. Perhaps when the 3 remaining volumes of the confessionals are completed, the underlying tenderness and compassion, which was now bequeathed to us by the Buddha and the medieval saints and now left for us by Gandhi, may percolate into American consciousness. I have noticed that the difference between my own writings and those of, say, Malraux, and, in spite of basic similarities, is that they had the catharsis of terror always with them, while I added to my inheritance of compassion the cruelty of the Greek dramas. The coincidence by which my first two novels have appeared in the Penguin World Contemporary Classics series and the critiques in your anthology may confirm for the contributors that their attention to these early novels has been confirmed by the recognition, even through a popular publisher, of the intensity of those writings. I hope this will persuade Penguin to publish those two books, which they have not yet done, perhaps from their apprehension of the American public not wanting to confront the human condition. I would like to send a copy of the issue to Dr. Inder Nath Chowdhury, Secretary, Sahitya Akademi. And could I have 6 more copies myself for my files, as I'm going to give most of the critical books and translations in various languages to the main libraries in India as well as the UK? Also, I wonder if this selection is from several papers read in the seminar on my autobiographical writings, or includes everything that was read in the gathering. If the other papers from the seminar are there, which are not included in this special issue, please could I have Xerox copies of those? Later on, some magazines like the Sahitya Akademi Literary Review may want to reprint a few of these critiques in your special issue. I will ask the editor to seek permission from you, but I feel that some of these perceptive essays may be reprinted in India. Anyhow, I will write to you about this when someone approaches me, but I thought even to ask your permission immediately to interest the Akademi magazine of your own introductory essay. Again, I want to thank you for your labors and my heartfelt gratitude for your persistence. With kindliest wishes, sincerely, Mulkraj Anand.
So we have about 20 minutes, 2 other speakers and questions and the ambassador. So this can be a small miracle to get all this in, but we will. I just have a quick question. Did you write the letters longhand or did you type them, and did he respond to you in English? And did he write them longhand or by typewriter?
Most of the letters were typed in English that he sent to me, but some of the letters were handwritten, which I had to edit before publishing those letters, and some of the letters I had to send him back to make sure that the language I have used in editing is acceptable to him, and because this is a kind of protocol that to follow.
If all of you remember correspondence back and forth from India in those days, I remember my mother waiting for the blue airmail letters to show up in the mailbox, right? I mean,
Friend Saros Kovaci also had some of the letters, and he edited those letters himself and put in the book form. He has donated his letters originally to Jamia Millia in Delhi, and he wants me to do the same thing, but I'm not certain what I'm going to do.
you should. That would be great. Let me call upon Dr. Platz, if you don't mind, a distinguished scholar, South Asian scholar from George Washington University, and we're honored that she could be here and has read the book and is familiar with the content and my dad's writings.
Now, it's a great honor for me to be here, and I have read this wonderful book, and I, although since we have the author himself talking about it, I really don't want to say more than to point out and to urge you to read it, that this is an amazingly richly comprehensive book. And this is, it's comprehensive in the sense that it approaches Anand in different ways, in the sense that there are very rich critical essays, and there is a personal interview, and there is this incredible cache of letters as well. And to be comprehensive and truthful on Anand is a feat almost impossible. This is a man, a myriad-minded man who lived forever, who spanned the 20th century, 1905 to almost made 100 years, and who wrote in every particular, every genre, and was, an ornery and creative and unpredictable character. And to tell the truth about him is a remarkable tribute and very precious tribute. But really, I'm less interested maybe in understanding, in celebrating and understanding Mulk Raj Anand than in celebrating Kamal Verma. I have known Dr. Verma for about 20 years since I started writing for the South Asian Review, and of which he was the great and transformative editor. I cannot overstate what he did for that journal. And it seems to me that this book epitomizes the Kamal Verma whom I've known over the years in various ways. Like all his productions, his own writing, his articles, his books, and the journal itself, the book is a work of a man who holds himself to the highest of standards. It's a work of immaculate scholarship. It's immaculate in the sense of its being monumentally and accurately researched. Dr. Verma always gets it right, and he will work on it till he gets it right. It is tightly argued. It is lucidly written. But along with that, around with that monumental, rational precision, like all his productions, this book shows the imprint of his romanticism. Romanticism in the technical way of teaching the British Romantics, but also in the larger spiritual way. He was trained, well, as I was, as a scholar of Romanticism and has written a formidable book on Shelley. And in all his work, he retains the romantic, the Shelleyan commitment to the importance of literature. And Shelley, you remember, at least Dr. Verma remembers, said that poets are the unacknowledged legislators of mankind. And by poets, of course, Shelley meant novelists as well. And this commitment makes Kamal Verma an impassioned study of Anand, who was himself an impassioned believer in the importance of literature to change the world. This book also evinces the editorial gifts that made Dr. Verma such a distinguished editor. He made the South Asian Review into the premier journal in the field in the world. And he did it by a generosity of spirit, by inviting established and also fledgling scholars to write for the journal. He did it by exercising a superhuman patience, I cannot describe, with inexperienced writers whom he taught with great patience to transform graduate school jargon into elegant prose. And you can see, and he also had the sense of what an issue of a journal looks like, that in combining the critical, the creative, writers from many different points of view, and this particular book, although it's written by one man, has a multiplicity of points of view. It has it's a unitary volume, notable for scholarly accuracy, for arranging point of view, for an imaginative juxtaposition of essays, interviews, and letters. And most of all, this volume displays what I prize most in Kamal Verma, his talent for friendship. His gift for friendship is displayed in this book as everywhere, in this unique collection of letters that he received from Anand. Now, what will it do, such a cache of letters from so busy and a figure as Anand? Obviously, Kamal Verma's sincere and vivid interest in Anand, his informed and intuitive questions stimulated this great writer into a return of engaged friendship. And it's a real tribute to Kamal Verma that Anand made this friendship offering of letters to him, and that Kamal Verma made this offer of friendship letters to us. So let's celebrate Anand's mind and art a bit this evening, but even more, I'd like to celebrate Kamal Verma's mind and art.
And Dr. Vijay Chauhan as well is here with us from Pennsylvania. And Dr. Chauhan and her husband and my dad have been colleagues and fellow South Asian scholars for a long time.
Thank you. As Rahulji said, I am subbing for my husband today because he was taken ill and he couldn't make it. So I will try to do justice to him. I can't imitate his voice, but I will try to read it in my own voice. I'll try to emulate the best. This is how the script goes. In the interest of time, I've been asked to sort of cut it a little short. I hope, Dr. Verma, you'll forgive me for doing that, though I know Pradyumna will not. So here we go. I heard of Kamal Verma long before I saw him. A mutual friend of ours mentioned him on a visit, saying, "Do you know there's another scholar from India in your neck of the woods? He's professor of English at Penn State, Johnstown, Pennsylvania." That was interesting, for there were few Indo-Americans then serving as professors of English in any American woods. I was suitably impressed by Professor Verma's credentials when I encountered them. He had done solid good work on English romantics and had published a book on Shelley's Epipsychidion. Most of us wanting to survive in American academia develop scholarship that happens to be in vogue either in British or American, Caribbean or Afro-American literature. Kamal Verma's take on the profession was rather unique. He was not satisfied just teaching British literature. Through his writings and his teachings, he had to introduce some Indian cultural icons and their works to his students, his friends, and to his colleagues. He thus became a cultural ambassador who never presented his credentials anywhere, but has been recognized everywhere for what he represents. By the depth of his scholarship, as much as by force of his convictions, he has persuaded many of his associates to take a look at his familiar works, at familiar works from an unfamiliar angle, if only to gain a fresh insight for themselves. Kamal Verma freely wrote about Tagore and Sri Aurobindo, introducing the latter's master poem Savitri to many readers unaware of Mahabharat's classic love story. Indeed, as editor of South Asian Review, Kamal devoted a whole issue to an investigation of Aurobindo studies. Needless to say that Professor Verma's scholarly pursuit with passage of time began to tilt towards South Asian writers and writing. The first evidence of that came out with his book, Critical Essays on Indian Writing in English, published by St. Martin's Press. He followed that critical work up with an introduction to Mulk Raj Anand's twin works brought out by Orient Paperbacks in 2011. And it is the fruition of that romance of Professor Verma's that we see displayed in his latest work here, Understanding Mulk Raj Anand, published a couple of months ago. It has very justifiably drawn tributes for its novel approach, its shrewd insights, and its bold conceptual design. Knowing both the artist Mulk Raj Anand and the critic Kamal Verma, I have to say that the best part of the book surfaces for me in their letters, both well-read and well-traveled, and both equally stubborn. If you read carefully, you catch the finer nuances of the dueling wits, the artist wanting to reorder the universe to his will, and the intellectual, unafraid, candidly, to advise even a willful king. There is, in those letters, candor and courtesy too, as is natural in the exchange between two exiles, between the one who returned and the other who didn't or couldn't. I'm sure not only will you enjoy the book, but also find it an excellent introduction to Anand's mind in case you want to catch up with that eminent novelist who wrote of India at the dawn of its freedom. I pay tribute to Kamal Verma for being one of the first Indo-American scholars who has done substantial work to alter in this country the climate for the reception of Indian writing in English. We celebrate you, sir, and your work as we also celebrate Mulk Raj Anand. Thank you very much.
Ambassador, I'm looking at the clock, and I know your time as well. And if there are, maybe we could take a couple questions, and then I'll turn it over to you, if that's okay. And I see a bunch of hands here. If you're related, you can ask a question.
Dr. Verma, how did the partition of India affected Mulk Raj Anand? And what were his views, and probably your views also, on the novel Train to Pakistan?
Mulk Raj Anand came back from England in 1945. And of course, we know the partition took place in 1947. But there are a lot of issues here. Anand and the Congress Party, Anand and Nehru, Anand and Gandhi, Anand and his friends in India. So what role did Anand play in the partition of the country? Did he agree? Or was he taken unawares just like most other Indians? Partition has two sides. One, of course, is the country was divided, but migration was never imagined that way, that people will have to leave their homes, or there will be so much of killing on both sides. So there are lots of issues, but you know, as a person coming from Punjab, he was more rooted in some of these issues. But he did not jump into those issues. After 1945, there are 4 books he wrote. He took a different route, biography, his own life, history, ideology. This is a very interesting book, trilogy. And this is another very good book, The Bubble. 2 years of the history of his PhD work in England. 2 years. How in 2 years he could wrap up everything almost. 600 pages. The philosophers, the politicians, English philosophers, German philosophers. One of my colleagues at the University of Pittsburgh, her name was Jean Sadler. She had a very interesting book on India, India in the German Mind. I didn't know how and why was she interested in India until she told me one day that this was her PhD thesis at the University of Chicago. Now, if you read that book, India in the German Mind, how were the Germans got interested in India? That's the point. and what particular issues were of interest to the Germans. Look, Schopenhauer, she says, studied the Upanishads, and this is from where Kant got his ideas of beauty, truth, and good.
Right, let's take it and then we'll have conversation. Should we just recognize someone? Or?
One more question.
I'm Wasim Anwar from Pakistan, Lahore, Foreman Christian College, Lahore. Very honored to be here, of course. My question would be like Peshawar in Pakistan has produced a lot of talent that belongs to India now. Anand's, maybe Devanand and then Anand. So how does Anand look back at the nostalgia, particularly related to his birthplace, Peshawar? So,
Anand was a very good student of the founder of Pakistan. And now tell us who founded Pakistan. As joke between the two of us, my friend Professor Wasim Anwar from Foreman Christian College, Lahore, and he and I had been talking about it. Anand was very close to Muhammad Iqbal. And during the early days, Anand was also a student of Muhammad Iqbal. But the issues are far greater. Anand wanted to go to Pakistan. Anand traveled a lot, but there came a time when he moved to Bombay, and this is then where he spent most of the time. He was very disappointed with Delhi. He was Tagore professor in Chandigarh. He was very close to some of the leaders, and you probably do not know that he was also a very good reader of Guru Nanak. He wanted to write a book on Guru Nanak. He came very close, but then the time ran out.
That's a good transition.
Right. Ladies and gentlemen, Ambassador of India.
Thank you. Absolute privilege to be here, Professor Verma, to be able to host you, to be able to listen to you, flanked by two very distinguished interlocutors whom we both know very well. And thank you for giving our sort of reading club that we have at the embassy this gravitas and the seriousness, which is not easy to attain nowadays in a world where anything that goes beyond whatever, what is it, 140 nowadays, becomes literature. So it's nice to have an old-fashioned book conversation and listen to somebody who has spent his life studying literature, analyzing literature, and what is most difficult is to be able to convey the meaning of that literature to others like us who would like to read and understand but don't have the critical eye very often. Very often, I wonder if I have gone through some of the essays overnight from your book. It's very impressive of the range of your thought and work. And honestly, very often writers begin to understand themselves after they read an analysis like this. So I'm not surprised that Mulk Raj Anand would reply extensively to your letters. He must have read your essays in the South Asia Review. and decided that you were an interlocutor who was giving his work meaning which would pass on to succeeding generations. So I think as much as we are here, as was rightly said by Professor Platz, that we should celebrate not only Mulk Raj Anand, but your tremendous contribution to the understanding of Indian literature in the United States and beyond, and your tremendous lifelong commitment to literary work. So our congratulations on that account, and I'm sure that there will be other books to follow after this. Mulk Raj Anand, well, you know, the India that we grew up in, the pre-Salman Rushdie India, when we looked at Indian writing in English, there used to be this trilogy of names, Mulk Raj Anand, Raja Rao, and R.K. Narayan. I don't know how fair it was to lump them all together, and I frankly don't know what they thought of each other. I know that Mulk Raj Anand and Raja Rao at least knew each other, but I'm certain. But they were, and he was, being the senior most amongst them, the doyen of Indian writing in English. And frankly, Irfan, I'm embarrassed to say that I'm quite happy he did not write in Punjabi. Not that, because, you know, it was not the beginning of the Indian novel. The Untouchable was not the beginning of the Indian novel, because novels had been written since Bankim Chandra Chatterjee, and who, you know, in every language. So if you go to Punjabi, or you go to Malayalam, or you go to Bangla, you will find a wealth of literature. But why I say I'm embarrassed, that because if he had written in Punjabi, he may still have remained unknown. Because you have great stars in all these literatures who have been writing about India, but it is a fact, whether we like it or not, that unless and until they have been translated into English, they will not find the wider audience that they deserve. So I'm very glad that he wrote in English. He did write about very difficult subjects. To write about untouchability in the 30s, as he did, to actually take on, in a way, Mahatma Gandhi. Because Mahatma Gandhi, if you recall, actually appears in the book. And there's a debate, in the sense, a larger debate, not direct, not face-to-face. And to take on issues like the Coolie, and to write the only novel written in English on the contribution of the Indian soldiers to the First World War. A novel which, honestly, I mean, if you read the other big novels, you read Remarque's All's Quiet on the Western Front, or you read Robert Graves' Goodbye to All That, you barely see a mention of an Indian soldier. And you do see one or two which are often disparaging. Natives. So, to have an Indian voice giving you the perspective from the Indian soldiers was a tremendous service. I have that book on my table, and it's due to be read, because this is the 100 years of the First World War, and no better time than now to read it. So he did write a lot of, tackle a lot of very difficult issues, and I think it went on. Post-Salman Rushdie, Indian writing in English has become fashionable, it has become widely respected, it has become well known. You've had Booker Prize winners, you've had everybody, but I think the contribution of people like Mulk Raj Anand to the beginning of that tradition, in times when people did not have access to England, I mean, to have been a person who personally knew the creators and creations like The Wasteland or 1984, I mean, itself would have given him a certain depth and perspective and value. which we may not have in anybody all the time simply because they're writing today or they happen to be abroad. I do have a personal recollection of Mulk Raj Anand, which I thought I should share with Professor Verma, and and when I see the date of your first letter, it must have been within 6 months of that letter. It was January 1992. I had written a small book. My first book was on the folk tales of Poland, and the Polish embassy in Delhi had decided to launch it. And I walked in not knowing who all would be there, and there was this gentleman sitting in one corner. And somebody told me, that's Mulk Raj Anand. And why he would come to a gathering with some young writers, a little launch about Polish folk tales, I don't know. But he was there. And so before the event, I sort of sidled up to him and sat next to him. And he said, so you've written this, now what are you going to write, or something like that. So I said, I want to write a novel. And then I thought, what better chance than sitting next to Mulk Raj Anand? You may as well ask the big question. I said, but I have a problem. I don't know what to write about. So, sometimes it's nice to be young. You can say all sorts of things. So Mulk Raj Anand turned to me and said, write about yourself. So I said, well, but normally people say, don't write about yourself. So, He says, no, if you cannot write about yourself, then how can you write about anybody else? And that was the end of our conversation. But I think that is something which I took to heart, because I said, if you really can't analyze your own thoughts and your own motivations, then what gives you the right to pretend that you know some other character better than yourself? So with that little personal anecdote, I would like to thank you. I'd like to thank Ambassador Rich Verma. I'd like to thank Professor Nuruddin. I'd like to thank the audience for a wonderful evening. Thank you very much.
It falls to me to have the pleasure of thanking everyone for making this such a special evening, in particular to all of our colleagues at the Indian Embassy. Thanks for all the hard work. We know all the effort that goes in behind the scenes to make an evening like this go so smoothly, so thank you all. And thank you, Ambassador, Madam, for being here. I should also say, as someone who came to America as an academic, I've been in the US now for 25 years, I've been a professor in the US for 14 years. It is very remarkable to be sitting next to someone like Professor Verma and thinking about what it must have been like to have come as Rich as Ambassador Verma remarked, in 1963, $14 and a bus ticket. I came with a little more and had nothing else. I had my parents' phone number in the back pocket for the plane ticket home at Christmas. But it is really, in many ways, such an incredible legacy, generations of students that he has taught and inspired. And of course, the great thing about being an academic is you can always believe that by writing your books, you touch students and educate people far beyond the reaches of your classroom. And it is very clear when you have the chance to read the book that you will see what a powerful teacher Dr. Verma must have been. It is also very clear that as a cultural ambassador, as Professor Chauhan's remarks, that the Vermas are a family of ambassadors. And right, in Dr. Verma's case, translating and being an ambassador for his native country and the literature of that country to new populations here. And in Ambassador Verma, what a remarkable story to go back to his father's homeland to represent his new country. And I can't think of a better testament. We said we'd stay away from politics, but I can't think of a better testament of the contributions of Indian immigrants to this country than this family right here. So thank you to both of you for all you've done for America and for India. And
I would just say The book is also available tonight in this room over here at 50% of the Amazon cost. And just to close things out.
Just two comments I would like to make. Peter Vera, who was a very distinguished British scholar and critic, after he read Anand's two novels, he says, "We all are untouchables and coolies." I repeat, we all are untouchables and coolies. I think another point I want to make is there is a side of Anand not very many of us know. Anand started the journal called Marg, M-A-R-G. 19 volumes of the Marg. Art, architecture, photography, and other issues. But more or less, the architecture of India, historical, the caves and Ajanta, Ellora, and all those. Some of my students, when I was editing the South Asian Review, we looked into Carnegie Mellon in Pittsburgh. Interestingly, they have most of the issues of Marg. We did not. University of Pittsburgh did not have any issues. But Carnegie Mellon has most of the issues. It's a very interesting side of Mulak Raj Anand. That he was a novelist, he was an essayist, he was a short story writer. I, in fact, wrote a preface to his 2 short stories, long time ago. But there was a side of Anand, and interestingly, when he was Tagore Professor of English at Chandigarh, he had some of the Punjab problems on his fingertips. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. And while we pick up the book, get it signed from the author, may I request everyone to please join us for a round of refreshments. And in this unending celebration of the Indian literary tradition, tomorrow we would be celebrating Hindi as Vishwa Hindi Divas with school kids here and with scholars studying Hindi. So please enjoy yourself, join us for refreshments. Thank you.